Michael walked into the store with a simple appearance, showing no signs of being someone who could change the entire luxurious atmosphere of the place. His shoes were worn, his jacket somewhat old-fashioned, and the backpack he carried on his shoulder seemed more like a burden than a fashion accessory. However, as he passed through the glass door, silence seemed to spread throughout the space, making the atmosphere unusually heavy. No one had spoken yet, but all eyes began shifting toward him. Cold, suspicious glances, as if he didn't belong here, as if he were an intruder in the kingdom of the wealthy and powerful. A staff member at the counter glanced at him and whispered to a colleague, "He shouldn't be here." That tone didn't need to be loud, for it was enough for everyone around to understand that Michael's presence was not welcome. Another glance from a customer nearby swept over him as if he were an invisible object in the space. Just a fleeting look, but it was like a sharp blade cutting off any hope of a welcoming. Michael didn't stop. He continued walking, showing no surprise, just the calm demeanor of someone used to not being welcomed. He walked straight to the watch counter, where expensive timepieces were displayed like priceless jewelry. These watches didn't just measure time, they measured a person's worth in the eyes of others. Michael stood there, his gaze fixed on a Philippe Nautilus, valued at $90,000. The light from the chandelier above reflected off the glass of the watch, creating a sparkling but cold scene. Michael didn't rush, nor was he flustered. He looked at the watch with the meticulousness of a doctor diagnosing a patient, or a card player studying the final card before deciding. He didn't need to say anything, just silently observing. Meanwhile, the saleswoman named Aurelia stood opposite, her hands skillfully arranging pearls on the table, but her gaze never shifted toward Michael. She tried to act as if she didn't see him, as if he were a ghost in the space. Her eyes were cold, even showing disdain. Her gestures seemed deliberately dismissive, as if trying to show contempt for the presence of someone unworthy of being there. Michael noticed the contempt in the air, but he didn't react. He just kept looking at the watch, as if he were the master of time in that room. Every gaze, every action of the people around him did not distract him. With just a focused stare, he made the space feel heavier. Time in the store seemed to stretch on endlessly. The whole store glowed under the lights, but the darkness in the hearts of the people grew thicker. Michael stood there like a challenger, saying nothing, but making everyone around him wonder, who is he? Surely none of them could have imagined that just minutes later, Michael would become the one to decide the future of this very place. Michael stood there silent as a statue, his gaze fixed on the Nautilus watch. The light reflecting off its glass made it shine, but also intensified the coldness, as if it were waiting for someone worthy to own it. The entire space seemed to go silent, with only the steady breathing of the unfamiliar customers and the suspicious looks from the people around. A middle-aged man, standing near the watch counter, glanced down at Michael's worn shoes, then looked up at the watch. His lips curled slightly, as if evaluating or perhaps assessing the intrusion of someone unfit for this space. Just a quick glance, but enough for Michael to feel the contempt from the unmasked glares. Everyone around him was looking, from head to toe, not with surprise but with judgment, full of hostility. Aurelia, the saleswoman, finally took her eyes off the pearls she was arranging, but her gaze wasn't aimed at Michael. She just glanced over briefly, her eyes indifferent, cold, as if to say he wasn't worth her attention. She didn't say anything, but her attitude made it clear. "He doesn't belong here," her gaze seemed to say. Michael didn't respond. He still stood still, his hands gently resting on the glass counter, eyes still locked on the watch as if it were the only valuable object in this world. Time passed, but Michael didn't seem in a hurry. He knew in this world of extravagance, time was the only thing that couldn't be bought, and he was here, in this space, as the one person who could control time. The discomfort from the stares didn't faze Michael. He was used to being ostracized, used to being an outsider, but that didn't make him stop. He just kept staring at the Nautilus watch, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to prove anything. His gaze, that calmness, was enough to make everything around him fall silent. Things had changed. No one in the store was paying attention to anyone else anymore. They were all looking at Michael, as if he were the flame lighting up the cold, sterile space. Just one person, yet everything had stopped. Suddenly, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. Conversations between customers grew quieter and then ceased entirely. The looks from the store staff, from the customers, from the onlookers, all focused on Michael. Not a word was spoken. All the breaths, all the gestures seemed to be waiting for something. Aurelia couldn't help but glance at him once more. This time her gaze couldn't hide her curiosity. She tried to suppress her discomfort, but couldn't stop looking. Michael remained still, saying nothing. But with every passing moment, he had become the focal point of everyone's attention. And as the silence in the room grew unbearable, only one question lingered in the air. Who is he? Time is never a companion in a space filled with scheming and class divisions. Michael still stood there, unmoving, as though he had become accustomed to the attention, accustomed to feeling like an outsider in a world that wasn't his. The light from the chandeliers above continued to pour down like pure rain, but it could not wash away the coldness in the air. Aurelia continued with her work, her hands brushing over the pearls with grace. But her gaze was no longer as indifferent as before. She knew Michael wasn't standing there to buy a watch or to be a regular customer. He had become a part of her picture, a picture in which dark patches were starting to appear. Michael didn't respond to her contempt. He simply stared at the watch with a chilling silence. He knew all the eyes were on him, and he understood everything. Each person here had a story, a reason to exist in this space. But he didn't need a reason. He just needed a moment. Time passed. The whispers among the customers grew louder, and the judging stares became sharper. Yet Michael remained steadfast, one foot planted on the ground, eyes never leaving the Felipe Nautilus watch. Suddenly, a different kind of look appeared. A woman entered the store, draped in a luxurious cashmere coat, her earrings glistening in the light. She passed by Michael as though he didn't exist, as if he were an invisible part of this extravagant painting. It was the look of arrangement, of an unspoken choice between those worthy and those unworthy. Aurelia felt a shift in the atmosphere. The woman with her shimmering coat made the entire store's lighting shine even brighter. She immediately approached the woman, flashing a perfect practiced smile, sweet and flawless, as if she had prepared to treat this customer like a VIP. Michael saw all of it. He knew that in this moment, he wasn't just an outsider. He was the one being excluded. But that didn't make him falter. He simply continued to stand there, saying nothing, not moving, and not letting any disdain shake his focus. With every passing second, his presence made everything around him seem more irrelevant. Aurelia continued to treat the woman as if she were royalty, and everything was being prepared for her. She smiled softly, satisfied, and didn't even glance at Michael. Everything seemed to be arranged just to serve those deemed worthy. But in this suffocating atmosphere, Michael's silence had its own power. There was no shouting, no confrontation, but his stillness became the sharpest challenge to the entire store. He didn't need to speak. His silence was enough to expose the superficiality and discrimination he was facing. Suddenly, a faint noise rang out. Michael quietly took his phone from his pocket and scrolled through a few notifications. A flight, a destination. The light from his screen reflected in his eyes, and in that brief moment, a soft whisper arose. The man next to him glanced at the screen of Michael's phone, and the word Tokyo became clear. The man's gaze couldn't hide his confusion. He looked from the ticket to Michael's worn shoes, the cracks on his old leather, and in that moment, he suddenly understood something. Though nothing was spoken, a question quickly formed in his mind. If he's truly poor, how can he be attending such an important meeting? Aurelia could feel the shift in the atmosphere. She glanced at Michael's phone, noticing the message about the meeting. There was something strange about it. This couldn't just be an ordinary mistake. She tried to remain calm, but the unease was starting to show in her words, now more rigid than before. "Do you know what you're doing?" Aurelia asked, but her tone was no longer confident. She placed the phone on the counter with a forced casualness. Michael simply nodded, offering no reply. Everyone around felt the tension in the air, but they all waited for something. A customer standing near the watch counter unexpectedly spoke up. He's not who we thought," came the voice, not questioning, but filled with a new sense of understanding. And in that moment, the judging eyes, the mocking looks, all began to change. The store began to hold its breath. and silence became the loudest answer to everything. Michael didn't need to say another word. What needed to be proved had already been done, without explanation. Everything continued in the tense atmosphere, but now all attention had shifted to Michael. He still stood there motionless, just with his phone in hand and his eyes never leaving the watch. The atmosphere in the store grew even more stifling, with every whisper seeming to get caught in the air. The looks of disdain, the judging glances, all focused solely on him. Aurelia, finally unable to maintain her cold demeanor, set down the pearls she was arranging carelessly and walked over to Michael, trying to keep a neutral expression, but the displeasure in her eyes was clear. She stopped in front of him, her slender frame facing a man who appeared ordinary in simple attire. It wasn't a direct confrontation, but in that moment, Michael's silence became the most direct challenge to the entire store. "Are you sure you want to look at that watch?" Aurelia said, her tone cold and indifferent. The words she used could easily be interpreted as an invitation, but hidden within them was contempt. She didn't believe that the man in front of her could possibly afford the piece. Michael simply nodded, his gaze still fixed on the Philippe Nautilus. He wasn't rushing, wasn't flustered. He had grown used to those kinds of looks that judged him by his outward appearance, by the material things others could see. A moment of silence stretched out. A full minute passed without anyone speaking. But then, that silence was shattered. A store employee standing by the counter walked over, his gaze sharp. "He doesn't have enough money to buy that watch," the man whispered, but loud enough for Michael to hear every word. And that was when everything changed. Michael didn't ignore it, nor did he become angry. He simply looked directly at the employee and then turned back to the watch, as though he were in control of everything in that room. Even his silence became a stronger weapon than any words. Aurelia's gaze could no longer hide her discomfort at Michael's unwavering confidence. She tried to appear calm, but deep down, she knew this man was not someone she could easily disregard like other customers. His unshakable composure, his calmness, was starting to make her question everything. Just moments later, another customer, a man in his 40s, approached Michael. He looked Michael in the eye, then glanced around at the luxury items around the room. His eyes lit up, not because of the glittering diamonds or gold, but because of the new understanding growing within him. He walked up to Michael, his gaze determined. "Right," the man said, his voice firm. "Not everyone deserves to be treated like that." Everyone in the store froze, the atmosphere shifting dramatically. This wasn't just about Michael anymore. This was about something larger. The story had turned into a battle for respect, for equality, and for dignity. Michael stood there watching the shift unfold. Aurelia, who had been so confident earlier, was now reduced to hesitation. She couldn't maintain her earlier attitude, and she knew it. Michael hadn't spoken much, but his presence, his silence, had dismantled the false hierarchy in the room. Celeste, still standing at the back, could feel the change in the air. She remained still, her gaze now heavy with uncertainty. The authority she once held was slipping away, and she couldn't ignore it. Michael's silent challenge had disrupted the status quo. Michael didn't need to speak again. Everything he had done, everything he had shown with his silence, had already changed everything. And now, those around him would have to reckon with their own actions, their own judgments. In this moment, Michael had won, not by force, but by simply being himself. And in doing so, he had made everyone else confront their biases, their assumptions, and the truth they had been avoiding. In just a few minutes, the atmosphere in the store had completely changed. Michael stood there unmoving, but his patience began to slowly drain away the confidence of all the eyes around him. He said nothing, but every step he took seemed to chew away at all the judgments that had been cast upon him. Aurelia still stood there, trying to maintain her cold, indifferent demeanor, but her gaze couldn't hide the growing sense of unease building inside her. Michael's indifference, his silence filled with defiance, wasn't something she could easily ignore. For the first time, she felt a sense of helplessness she couldn't control. But then, something unexpected happened. The glass door behind Michael made a sharp ding, a sound that cut through the tension like a bell signaling a shift. No one knew exactly what it was until Michael pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. Those standing nearby saw the name appear on his screen. Board meeting, 15 minutes. The faint words weren't immediately noticed, but for the onlookers it seemed like a cruel reminder. A man standing by the window glanced over, then quickly looked down at Michael's shoes, his worn, cracked leather shoes, and then he suddenly understood something. While nothing was said, the question quickly appeared in his mind. If he truly has no money, then how can he be attending such an important meeting? Aurelia felt a change in the air. She glanced at Michael's phone, then quickly turned her gaze back to the watch counter. There was something strange about this. This couldn't just be an ordinary mistake. She tried to maintain her composure, but her words began to falter with a nervous tension. "Do you know what you're doing?" Aurelia spoke up, but her voice had lost the earlier confidence. She placed the phone on the counter with a feigned casualness. Michael merely nodded, not responding. Those around him could feel the tension rising, but they all waited for something, anything. A customer standing by the watch counter and having been silent up until then, suddenly spoke. "Maybe we've misunderstood," the voice said, not with accusation, but with a hint of realization. And in that moment, the judging eyes, the mocking looks, all began to change. The store seemed to hold its breath, and the silence became the loudest answer to everything. Michael didn't need to say anything else. What needed to be proven had already been done without explanation. The atmosphere in the store grew even heavier. The critical looks, the mocking remarks continued to hit Michael like cold waves, but he still stood there, his eyes unwavering, his heart unmoved. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to justify anything. His silence was his only affirmation. Aurelia stood opposite him, tense. She couldn't stop looking at Michael, then down at the phone in his hand, as if waiting for some sign, some change. But Michael didn't move, didn't change. Then another voice broke through the stillness. A man behind the counter, looking at Michael from head to toe, spoke quietly to his companion. "Doesn't he know this place is for people with money? He must think he can buy that watch," but his voice was dripping with contempt. Michael felt not only the coldness from Aurelia, but also the disdain from the people around him. Each word felt like a knife cutting into his mind, but he didn't react, just stayed silent, his eyes still fixed on the Philippe Nautilus. Then something unexpected happened. Celeste, the manager of the store, walked up with an air of authority. Every step she took exuded confidence, as though all the attention in the room belonged to her. She didn't look at Michael, but instead fixed her gaze firmly on Aurelia, her eyes cold as if giving a silent command. "You can't let someone like him stay here," Celeste said, her tone frosty, clearly showing no respect for Michael. All eyes in the room turned to them, but what was most noticeable was Michael's gaze, still unchanged. He looked at Celeste, silently, no words, no extra gestures. Just a heavy silence between him and her. Aurelia stood there, still confused about what was happening. She didn't know where she was pushing Michael, but the anxiety was now clearly visible on her face. The things Celeste had said, though full of authority, seemed to have lost their power, as though the air around them was beginning to shift. Then, when everyone thought they had already labeled Michael as just another ordinary man, he pulled out a card from his jacket pocket. The store fell silent. No one knew what to expect next. The card, though it had no flashy symbols, no prominent logo, carried a power that couldn't be denied. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the card, causing all eyes in the store to focus on it. Aurelia took the card with a trembling hand, her eyes glued to it, then slowly moved her gaze back to Michael. Her heart seemed to stop. "Whose card is this?" Aurelia asked, her voice faint with confusion. But deep inside, she already knew the answer. Celeste, standing there, did not speak. She knew exactly what that card represented. The whole store had suddenly gone silent. The customers, who had once looked down on Michael, were now beginning to realize something they hadn't before. Michael didn't need to say anything more. The answer was clear in the card he had just placed on the counter. A customer standing nearby couldn't help but speak up. "He must not be just anyone," came the voice. It wasn't a question, but a realization. And in that moment, the looks, the judgment, the mocking glances finally started to shift. The store began to hold its breath, and the silence became the most profound answer to everything. Michael didn't need to explain. What he needed to prove had already been demonstrated in an instant. And now the people around him would have to face their own actions, their own judgments. In this moment, Michael didn't win with words, he won with his presence. And in doing so, he made everyone else confront their biases, their assumptions, and the truth they had been avoiding. The silence in the store was now even heavier. Every eye was on Michael, and no one dared to laugh or mock him anymore. The judgmental glances had lost their sharpness, replaced by confusion. What had just happened couldn't be denied. Michael was not who they had thought him to be. Aurelia stood frozen, her hand still clutching the card like it was an unfamiliar object. Her eyes quickly flickered to Celeste, who was standing still with a cold expression, but there was something new in her eyes, an unease that had never been there before. She wasn't as confident as she had been earlier, no longer sure of her judgment of Michael. The store remained immersed in silence. The whispers of the customers had faded, and the glances full of suspicion were now focused on the sales staff. They were beginning to realize that they had made a mistake. They had judged a person based on his appearance, without knowing anything about him. A customer who had been silent until now, standing by the watch counter, suddenly spoke up. "Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. This man is not what we thought," the voice said, not in an accusatory tone, but with a new awareness. This statement didn't criticize anyone directly, but it made everyone in the store feel uneasy. The story was no longer about Michael buying a watch. It had become about the values he represented. He wasn't just another customer with a credit card. He had become a symbol of defiance against the store's prejudices. Celeste felt the shift in the atmosphere, but she still didn't want to admit defeat. Still, Michael's presence, in the card he had presented, had shattered the mask she had worn for so long. She suddenly felt cornered, without an escape. Michael didn't speak again. He just looked at the Philippe Nautilus watch that he had been eyeing earlier. The light from the store's chandeliers reflected off the glass of the watch, highlighting the cracks in everything around him. It seemed as though the watch was no longer just an expensive item. It had become a symbol of truth and the true value of a person. Aurelia, not knowing what to do, finally dropped her hand. She looked at the card again, her eyes vacant. The atmosphere in the store was still full of expectation, as if everyone was waiting for a change, for an explanation, for a conclusion from Michael. But he remained silent, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. A customer nearby, not sure if it was accidental or intentional, spoke out. "Maybe we were wrong to judge someone based on their appearance." These unspoken words from the customers and staff summed up everything. The judgmental stares were no longer there, and the glances had softened. Everyone was slowly beginning to understand that discrimination couldn't exist in a place that should respect all customers, no matter who they were or where they came from. Michael simply shook his head, then turned back to look at the watch once more, as if marking the end of a new chapter in his life. And with that, he picked up his phone, signaling that everything had been set in motion. Not just the story of a watch, but a story of change in the way people perceive and treat each other, beyond the societal standards that had been established. He didn't need to say anything else. What needed to be proved had already been made clear. No further explanation required. Throughout the store, every gaze slowly shifted from doubt to realization. Michael stood there, not showing anger or disappointment, simply silent, allowing the things around him to speak for themselves. The customers began to glance at each other, as if they were starting to see something they hadn't noticed before. A staff member at the front desk stood frozen, her hand still holding the phone. She looked at the screen, feeling the change in the air, then glanced up at Michael again. No longer was there contempt in her eyes. No longer was there a rushed judgment. There was only admiration and perhaps a bit of regret. Aurelia stood still, no longer trying to maintain her cold expression. She didn't dare look any of the customers in the eye anymore. Her confidence had vanished, replaced with hesitation. She had no way of countering the truth she was now faced with. The things she and Celeste had thought they could control were now beyond their reach. "We were wrong," a voice came from behind the counter. A middle-aged woman, who had been quietly observing everything, looked toward Aurelia, then turned to Michael. "I'm sorry for thinking you didn't belong here." From every corner of the room, the looks shifted. No longer filled with discrimination, now they were full of respect. They were beginning to realize that they had been wrong to judge someone by their appearance alone, without knowing who they truly were. Aurelia, not knowing what to do, let go of the card. She looked at it one more time, her eyes hollow. The atmosphere in the store was still thick with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something, for an explanation, for a final word from Michael. But he remained silent, and his silence made everything clearer than any explanation could. A customer, standing near the watch counter, suddenly spoke. Maybe we've been wrong in judging people by their appearance. These unspoken words, coming from both customers and staff, summed up everything. The glances of contempt were no longer present, and the looks had softened. Everyone was gradually beginning to understand that discrimination had no place in a place that was meant to respect every customer, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Michael simply nodded, shook his head, and looked back at the watch once more, as if marking the end of one chapter in his life. Then he picked up his phone, signaling that everything had shifted. This was no longer about a watch, but about a transformation in the way people perceive and treat one another, beyond the societal barriers they had imposed. He didn't need to say another word. What needed to be proven had already been shown, and no further explanation was needed. The atmosphere in the store had completely changed. No longer was there the cold, suffocating tension. The staff stood motionless, no one daring to speak. Everyone knew that what had just transpired couldn't be undone. The phones continued to record everything. Images and videos were being shared online, but now everyone recognized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a movement, a significant change. Michael remained standing there, amid the bright lights and glittering jewelry. He didn't need to say anything more, didn't need to prove anything. There was enough evidence to show who he was, and his actions had already spoken louder than words. Aurelia stood near the counter, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the jewelry, but she couldn't stop glancing at Michael. Every time she looked at him, her confidence faded even further, replaced by regret and fear. No matter how hard she tried to appear indifferent, she couldn't hide the unease that was growing inside her. "You know, I won't be here much longer," Michael finally said, his voice soft but authoritative. There was no anger in his words, just the simple truth. "It's not always necessary to prove that you belong somewhere, but if I did, I would never accept this kind of discrimination again." Aurelia didn't respond. She only nodded slightly. She couldn't argue, couldn't fight back. There was only silence and the unmistakable feeling of regret in her eyes. Suddenly, a man, about 40 years old, walked up to Michael. He met Michael's gaze, then glanced around at the luxury items surrounding the room. His eyes lit up, not because of the glimmering diamonds or gold, but because of a newfound understanding. He stepped closer to Michael, his gaze firm. "Right," he said, his voice steady. "Not everyone deserves to be treated like this." Everyone in the store froze. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. This was no longer about Michael. This was about something larger. The story had evolved into a fight for respect, equality, and dignity. Michael stood there, watching the transformation unfold. Aurelia, who had been so confident earlier, now stood in hesitation. She no longer knew how to respond. Michael hadn't said much, but his presence, his silence, had dismantled the false hierarchy in the room. Celeste, still standing at the back, could feel the change in the air. She remained still, her gaze now filled with uncertainty. The authority she once held was slipping away, and she couldn't ignore it. Michael's silent challenge had disrupted the status quo. Michael didn't need to speak again. Everything he had done, everything he had shown with his silence, had already changed everything. And now the people around him would have to reckon with their own actions, their own judgments. In that moment, Michael had won, not through force, but through his presence. And by doing so, he made everyone confront their biases, their assumptions, and the truth they had been avoiding. A week after the event in the store, the change had spread beyond the walls of the store and throughout the entire city. The image of Michael, with his simple black card and unshakable demeanor, had become a symbol of awakening that many hadn't expected. The videos from that live stream continued to be shared, with comments and posts reminding everyone of Michael's words about respect, fairness, and the power of truth. People began to become more aware of the subtle discrimination they had often overlooked. And more than that, they realized that change didn't always begin with grand revolutions. but sometimes with one person daring to stand up and speak the truth. The store, which had once been filled with bright lights and luxury items, was no longer just a symbol of coldness and division. Every employee, from the sales staff to the management, began to change the way they saw their work and their customers. They weren't just selling products anymore. They were selling respect, patience, and sincerity. On the first day the store reopened after the change, Michael returned once more. Not to cause a scene or make another grand gesture, he just wanted to see if the changes were real, if they would actually be maintained. He walked in without any sign of arrogance and with no spotlight on him. But as he entered, the air in the store seemed to lighten. The employees had changed. There were no longer sharp, judgmental glances, no longer condescending remarks. They had learned how to listen, how to serve with not just professionalism, but with respect for every customer. Michael was satisfied to see that the things he had said had not just been empty words. They had been put into action. He didn't walk over to the watch counter, nor did he stop to look at the Philippe Nautilus he had once studied. Today, he walked past the counter and straight toward a corner of the room where a group of customers were being served. He simply stood at a distance, watching. The employees no longer felt the pressure of the wealthy customer's gaze. They had become more open, more comfortable in their work. And with each customer, they didn't just sell a product, they sold kindness and respect. Michael felt a sense of satisfaction seeing that what he had said that day had not only been a statement, but had turned into a living, breathing change. By the counter, a middle-aged woman, a new customer, was chatting happily with a saleswoman. She was laughing with the staff, and she didn't feel the judgment or disdain that she had felt in high-end stores before. Michael smiled softly as he saw that. It was the clearest evidence that real change had occurred. He turned and left, not needing to say anything more. He had done what he needed to do. And now the only thing left was for the changes to continue to grow, to spread, not just in this store, but everywhere. For Michael, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for justice, for respecting human dignity, and for recognizing true value. Not in the money in one's account, but in how we treat each other. The store was no longer just a place for selling expensive jewelry. It had become a place where every customer felt welcomed and respected. And all that Michael had done was pave the way for a fairer world, where everyone, no matter their appearance or background, could walk in and feel valued. As Michael walked out of the store, everything returned to normal once again. But this time, normal had a completely different meaning, and perhaps the world would never be the same again. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.